quiver's full of hope. I've got the urge to walk the prairie and chase the antelope. Aspens gold on snow-capped peaks, the elk call me away. I can't keep my mind on working on this fine September day. I've got Nimrod neurosis, longbows on the brain. I'm a
TradQuest podcast. Carson Brown, what's up, buddy?
Hey, what's going on? My phone said scam likely, so I guess
We're scamming.
I don't know. How's it going, James?
Pretty good, buddy. Yeah. What's going on at Sherwood Shafts? Fill us in.
Making lots of shafts. I got a lot of orders here the last few days, and just staying busy. Got a good amount of material coming in. Purchased a couple really nice salvage logs, some high cascade that just beautiful wood, tight ring to the core, has spine. Ran some through, pushed some through the process just to double check spine after the initial purchase of a 20-foot section of this log. You know, it's like, hey, this is beautiful, really high yield, no limbs, super straight, just beautiful wood.
Very nice.
It's like I just, but spine's always a question. So push some through process. It has spine, and so went back and purchased another 20-foot section. The yield's just incredible. So really getting a lot out of this 40-foot section of log. So that's the first 20 foot's all flitched up, turned and milled up into boards, and stickered up. So
when you say it has spine, you're talking about being able to take care of the 60, 65 up to the 80, 85, 85, 90 type stuff.
Yeah. It's always hard to tell when you push things through the process because it's green going through the molder and then shrinks, and so it's just a little different. I don't want to. I love it if it produces some 85 90s. It might. I don't know for sure, but it's definitely going to have a high quantity of 65 70, 60 65s that are really popular right now, it seems, and then some 70 75s for sure, 75 80s, and there should be some getting up into that 80, 85. So that's something I haven't gotten in, except for one small log that produced some real high spine, like starting at 70, 75. Other than that, haven't seen much high spine in any of the recent stuff run. So it's a good log to be working on right now.
Very nice. Selfishly, I'm hoping for some 80, 85. So hopefully, there's a little bit of that in there. And I did see some photos you've been posting on Instagram, and it definitely is some beautiful wood that you've got your hands on. So that's pretty exciting news.
Yeah. And hey, for the 80, 85 guys like yourself, James, I'm really fortunate for this resource. It's not the cheapest source for Douglas fir, but it's a fellow that deals in export grade logs, and he mills them up for just CVG, clear vertical grain fir, for high-end doors and molding. And he's right around the corner from me. It's like a 20-minute drive, and he's got stacks of these logs. He's in good with a few of the right loggers, and so he's up there hand-picking trees in some of these salvage units on Forest Service land. I'd like to be doing what he's doing myself, but just not plugged in with the right people at this point to be doing that. So he's a good middleman for me. Like I said, right around the corner, and I get to go just look through stacks of logs. And so what I was going to say is he's got a few that have a couple slightly smaller diameter, maybe 30-inch diameter logs that have real high spine written all over them. They look stout, real heavy, dark, what we call winter growth rings, heavy resin rings. So those will be next.
Well, that's super exciting news, and for all of us guys that love traditional arrows, wood arrows, we're excited to hear that. And I know that you've been working your tail off because you didn't show up to bear camp. You didn't show up to Western States. You were not at the rendezvous at the river. And I know in the future, or in the past, you would have been at all those things, but you've been working your tail off to keep Sherwood Shafts producing ammo for all of us traditional shooters. So we do appreciate that. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, no problem. I've missed the shoots, missed seeing folks. I knew I was biting off a lot to chew, taking on the business myself, but yeah, it was this particular log has me feeling really good. Is exactly what I've been looking for, and spent some time looking for it up in the woods myself as a up in driving the Foresters roads, and just wasn't having any luck. So bit the bullet, bought a nice one, and yeah, it's turned out to be exactly what I need right now. So might be able to start attending things again. Hope to attend September.
That's the most important part, that you can make some time for the Wapiti season just around the corner, September. And I do have a resource that I need to reach out to, a timber faller, and he runs several timber fallers down in the Siskiyous, which is, Northern California, and that could be promising. And so I'm going to look into that for you, and that's a good transition into who we have on the show tonight. Speaking of California, we have a friend of ours, Jack Harrison. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to be putting out a 2-part series with Jack. You actually introduced me to Jack.
Yeah, I can't remember how I first came in contact with Jack. I haven't met him in person yet, but I think maybe it was through some staves. He was looking for juniper stave. He was doing some real replica type bows, like sinew-back juniper, and contacted me for staves. I think that's how we first started chatting, and he's definitely into the primitive side of things, and so we just ended up comparing notes and talking quite a bit on the phone, and that's how I got to know Jack.
Yeah, and when I heard, Jack was a younger guy, meaning younger than us, I'm always excited to hook up with these guys, and so I reached out to Jack on the gram, and me and Jack have become. It's pretty strange. It's pretty strange to call him a really good friend, because I've actually yet to meet him in person, and usually I wouldn't say that about somebody, but I literally talk to Jack every day, and have been for some time, and he's definitely a go-getter. He's been stacking up some pretty nice bucks and hogs down there in California, and we actually didn't get into that in this episode, so that's why I said we're going to do a 2-part series with Jack. The first part, Jack runs a survival school down there in central Northern California, and he's had anything from working with children to adults to law enforcement, military, to celebrities, and he's a pretty talented young man and is making an impact on the survival school side of things, and we really just got into all things survival from a hunter's perspective.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be well received, and I know TradQuest, you guys are expecting traditional bow hunting, all the time, and trust me, he's a traditional bow hunter, but we really just dove into the situation. We got September coming around the corner, and with guys that are elk hunting or mule deer hunting or bear hunting or whatever your adventure is going to be, we really put out some great information. I learned a lot talking to Jack, some things that I just overlooked about the survival situation. You think that it's not going to happen to you until it does. And we really covered all bases on that topic, and I hope you guys go ahead and listen to it from the beginning to the end, because there's some gold nuggets in there, And I hope you don't need this information, but you should be listening and practicing and making sure that your pack has the right things in it. And as you will hear in this podcast, I touch on some to a hunter that never made it home here in Oregon, and meaning he never made it home. He's been missing for 5 years. And so we talk about that, and it's really important that you are prepared in case you get put in this situation. So I think that you guys will enjoy this one. And stay tuned for part 2, where we dive into bow hunting boars and blacktails with Jack Harrison. And yeah, I think it should be well received.
He's looking forward to it. I know Jack has, he strikes me as someone in terms of a bow hunter who, understands what it takes and takes putting in the time. I see from him that he really puts in the time. So I'm sure he has that same approach to the survival school that he's a part of and teaches. So, I'm sure he's a wealth of knowledge on that subject for a young man.
Yeah, absolutely. So hope you guys enjoy that. And if you've been waiting on some high spine arrows from Sherwood Shafts, sounds like Carson is getting close to producing those. And we appreciate you supporting the podcast. And if you guys are enjoying the show, don't forget to support us on our Patreon. And don't forget to support Carson Brown at Sherwood Shafts and Andy Ponce at Addictive Archery. Carson's got you covered on the raw shaft material, and Andy has got you covered on custom built, awesome, beautiful arrows. So once again, enjoy the show. TradQuest Podcast. I'd like to welcome a buddy of mine on the show today, Jack Harrison. What is going on, Jack?
Oh, not much, man. I'm really excited to be here. Feel like I've been listening to this show for a long time, and it's great to finally be on here. Yeah,
well, this should be pretty natural for me and you, since we talk just pretty much daily. So yeah, I'm excited to have you on and share kind of your life story and how it relates to traditional bow hunting and woodsmanship skills and that type of thing. So I don't know, why don't you head and just get us started and tell us a little bit about you and where you live and what you're up to.
Right on. Cool. So my name's Jack Harrison, and I live in Central California. Currently, most of my life I've lived, around San Francisco Bay Area. I currently live in Santa Cruz, California, which is, roughly an hour and a half south of San Francisco. I've been deeply immersed in nature from a survival perspective, learning about plants, animals, tracking, and hunting since I was very young. Hunting didn't come in until a little bit later, but I'm a professional survival instructor, which for me, what that means is I teach people the skills they would need to stay alive in the woods, along with a lot of other skills. And I work with a wide variety of different user types and demographics, from, famous tech workers to celebrities to kids, general public adults, and California Highway Patrol, search and rescue. All different types of user groups come through and train with me and with the company that I work for. And yeah, I love what I do. I'm super passionate about it. I live and breathe, as you know, everything nature, whether it's learning about animals or learning trees or tracks or whatever it is. It's always been my obsession, and I can't say it's changed at all since I was 10 years old.
So how did that start? You say 10 years old. So, a lot of 10-year-olds nowadays are hooked on video games. Obviously, my generation, we played outside.
Right.
Like, how did you go from embracing the outdoors as a young kid to gaining the skill set that you have now?
So I think a lot of it came from being in the generation that I am in, and I just turned 33 years old. So I was born in 1988, and obviously there wasn't a whole lot of technology. I mean, we had the internet and some video games when I was a kid, but that wasn't something I ever had available to me to a point where that's how I was using my time. So my family, my grandparents probably, and my parents got me outside when I was really young, went backpacking, fishing, fly fishing, spending all of our time outside. And ultimately we ended up moving around quite a bit. And when I reflect back on that question you just asked me, I think moving around a lot and living in somewhat rural places was a huge catalyst in me learning what I have learned and continuing to do that. Because as you know, when you move around a lot, it's hard to make friends. And when you're living in rural areas, nature's always there. Like if you move somewhere in the summertime and you can't go to school to make friends, then you go into the woods. And so that was just my outlet. And it got to a point where I actually started going to this like program through a kid that I met at school. It was called Birch Heart, and it was on the East Coast. And it was a weekend program, and I started going to that, and it was all about like different survival skills, primitive skills. It was a bunch of students from a place called the Tracker School in New Jersey, which some folks might be familiar with. And, I'd go there on the weekends and we would be sleeping in debris shelters or primitive shelters. We'd be, catching snakes and eating them, or gigging frogs, or catching fish, or making pottery or cordage, flint knapping, building bows. We did a lot of different skills at that camp or weekend. I don't know what you'd call it. We'll just call it camp. We did a lot of different skills, and eventually, after I'd been doing that for a couple of years, I eventually kind of moved into a leadership position when I was about 14 years old, from the extent of like helping other students learn. And anyways, it just kind of kept rolling from there. I was always obsessed with it. And when I was a kid, I caught a lot of flack for it in school, being called like nature boy and woodsy, but being outside, learning about nature, reading books about nature, that was just where my obsession laid. And I'd like to credit a bunch of people for teaching me what I know, but to be honest, a lot of that just came from me wanting to know, how to make fire with sticks, and reading about it in a book and seeing several people do it, and then figuring it out on my own. So there was a lot of that throughout my life, and as well as bow hunting, because starting out, I never did have a mentor, and that's something we could talk about later, until recently. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, I just spent a lot of my time outside, and like most kids do. And, it was just, building forts and making traps and, finding old tree stands and bottles of like cover scent. and sometimes an old arrow here and there. And I was just super fascinated with that. And ultimately, I think that's what really led me into my curiosity with hunting. And for context, a lot of this took place in Connecticut, where I lived at the time.
Okay, so were there primitive bows being built at that time? Like, where did archery start to fit in? And then also, you'd mentioned books. Are there some books that were influential in your development in some of these skills?
Yeah, absolutely. So archery kind of came into the picture when I was really young. Actually, my mom was telling me a story the other night about to potty train me, to get me to use the toilet. She told me that she'd get me a bow and arrow if I started using the toilet when I was a little kid. And I guess all of a sudden it was like fixed, and I was using the toilet from there on out, and I got my bow and arrow. So it started a lot earlier than I actually remember. But from what I remember, from a primitive perspective and building bows from nature, I built my first bow when I was, I think, 13 years old, maybe 12, 13, 14, somewhere around that time. It was a hickory bow. It was at one of these a camp that I would go to, and I remember we cut that hickory tree down with a stone adze, which is a napped. Basically, it's a primitive version of a hatchet. Would be the best analogy. And so we cut this tree down with the stone adze and roughed it out with that stone adze, and then broke out our pocket knives and got it going. And we made a green hickory bow there. And that was the beginning of my obsession. And I built my first sinew back bow when I was 16 years old. I built, many different hickory bows. As a teenager, my favorite wood was California Bay laurel. I ended up moving back to California. So our archery started young, and it started with, a Bear archery fiberglass, bow, a kid's bow. And eventually I broke that and started making them from wood. And it just kind of snowballed from there. Yeah.
And so touching back on those books, are there a few books that you like I said, that were inspired you to?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So some of the most inspiring books when I was a little kid, I think, include My Side of the Mountain. That was one of the earliest ones that I read that just turned me into, a kid that wanted to live in the woods. And My Side of the Mountain is a story about a kid that runs away and, builds a house inside of like a hollowed out tree and, catches a peregrine falcon and is hunting with it. So that book was really inspiring. I did eventually get into some books written by a fellow named Tom Brown Jr., who is the founder of the Tracker School, which is that school I referenced that I would do kids camps through on the East Coast. And his books were really inspirational for me. There was a lot of incredible stories in his books. He's written a number of different field guides. I think he's got to have written over 20 different books and field guides, or right around that. And reading his books was a huge inspiration for me. I can clearly remember getting home from school and like opening up the field guide and picking a skill and then just going out there and doing it. And that was kind of like what I did every day instead of homework for my entire teenage and young adult years.
That's very interesting. Is this where you ran into and became friends with Bill McConnell, who's a guy we've had on the show?
So, yeah, Bill was, when I was really young, he was still sort of a legend because at that time he was head instructor of the Tracker School, and there weren't a lot of kids going through the Tracker School. The Tracker School had the kids program, which was known as Coyote Tracks, and it was a different foundation. And Bill was teaching the adult programs through Tracker School. And I met Bill probably when I was like 17 or 18 years old in Montana, driving out to his house. At that time, I remember we drove out there with a bunch of Osage self bows just to get him to look at them. I think some stone points too, but we drove all the way out from Washington just to go like show these bows to Bill and see, were they good? Were they bad? Etc. Hung out with him. He had just gotten back from, I think, a caribou hunt. So he had a bunch of caribou quarters just like laying in the garage. So he was living in Bozeman at that time. And Bill was a big inspiration for me. It still is, and is an incredible primitive hunter and somebody who's truly lived it. And growing up, I would hear a lot of stories about Bill. And he's someone who I have a lot of respect for and look up to. And I was really stoked that you guys got him on the show because he truly is, one of the few people that's really lived it when it comes to primitive skills and specifically primitive archery.
Yeah, I really enjoyed having Bill on, and definitely a guy that we need to get back on the show and catch up with. I try to stay in touch with him, and like you said, he's just a really inspiring guy and really, embraces the woodsmanship skills that are kind of lost art of today and whatnot. So if you guys want to go back and listen to that was episode 80 with Bill McConnell. primitive bow hunting and woodsmanship skills. So that's a great episode. So yeah, that's really cool that he's a friend of yours, and you've been able to obtain a little bit of mentorship from him and whatnot. So Washington, I'm hearing the East Coast, California. It sounds like you've moved around a lot. How were you able to continue this lifestyle from state to state? Is it hard to find, like you said, the woods are everywhere, but to continue your building of knowledge and these skills?
Right. So for me, a lot of those moves took place when I was a minor. And so my dad worked for IBM. And so, IBM stands for I've been moved. And so you're going all over the place. And so Washington, so basically I was born in California. I lived in California until I was about 10 years old. We moved to Indiana, lived in Indiana. I spent a short time in Mexico, and then the East Coast, Connecticut for 6 or 7 years. Eventually moving back to California. I graduated high school in California, and I actually moved up to Washington, where I spent a year studying tracking, and, a bunch of different, nature related skills, and studying those up there in Duval, Washington, through a school that is known as the Wilderness Awareness School. So instead of going to college, I chose to go do that. And that was an incredible experience. And I met a lot of great people and was introduced to the Pacific Northwest. Got to see Roosevelt elk, got to really just experience hunting on a little bit of a deeper level. When I went up there, in California, there is a big hunting culture, but it's kind of tucked in. And where I grew up in California, there's not a lot of public land, at least for a teenager, right? You can't drive 30 minutes away and hit public. We're talking like 2.5 to 4 hour drive at least in any direction, sometimes further.
California doesn't have a lot of those like broken up small pieces of public, but they do have some giant, huge pieces of public land that a lot of people don't realize. California's a big state, and it's, even though it's, I'm originally from California as well, as you know, and when you drive through that state from top to bottom, it's a long one, and people think of just the cities and the concrete and the bridges and the big skyscrapers, but California is a large state, and it has a lot of wild places in it.
Oh yeah, I think it's ranked like number 9 as far as most public lands in the United States. Yeah. And just like you said, we have these giant chunks, but there is kind of this middle part of the state where we don't have these small pieces, and the pieces that are designated as public, either you can't hunt on, or the attitude around hunting in California isn't necessarily negative, but there's not the hunting culture that there used to be. And so for my generation, there just wasn't as much opportunity to access hunting if you didn't have a vehicle and didn't want to drive, several hours, or had a mentor to take you out. Prior to my generation here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's tons of hunting, and a lot of that hunting is the reason we have tule elk. It's the reason we had axis and fallow deer that were, eradicated, wild boar. There's a lot of animals that were brought here specifically for hunting. And at one point in time, California was, all about hunting. If you look at the history of the state, there was game refuges everywhere. But it still is, but it's changed a little bit.
No, yeah, California is a sportsman's paradise for sure, and it'd be really easy for us to dive right into that hole, right at the beginning of this podcast. And I really want to circle back to your journey into bow hunting, but I'd like to touch on some of the stuff that we started in the beginning of this conversation, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about how you took this passion and love for the outdoors and these skills that you learned from these schools and books and mentors like Bill, and was able to turn that into a career? Like, did you go to college a little bit, or at what point did you decide that this is the path I'm going to use to pay my bills, and then what does that look like? What are the teachings and the things you provide or offer to the public? I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think as far as like how I ended up doing what I do now, I think that's a great question, because in my field, a lot of people fall out of it, or they dream to do what I'm doing, but don't necessarily make it. And so it is very hard to professionally be a survival instructor, because it's hard to live off of that. So there's a lot of folks that are like accountants, but then teach survival classes on the side. And I've never had a different job. I've been a survival instructor, and then as an adult, I did some hunting and fishing guiding on the side, which we can talk about later if we decide to. To answer your question, from a really young age, I was introduced to these people that were teaching survival. People like Bill, people like, a really close mentor of mine, Cliff Hodges, who I work with. I was introduced to these people that were really inspiring. They were teaching, right? And as a naive teenager, I believed I thought it was awesome living in your Tacoma, driving around teaching. I thought that was like the coolest thing in the world, and that's what I wanted to do. And, there's a funny joke that kind of gets thrown around about like primitive skills and survival instructors. And that's like, what do you call I might butcher it, but it goes, what do you call a survival instructor with Tacoma without a girlfriend? And the answer is homeless, right? Because they all live in their trucks driving around. And so anyways, I just looked at them from when I was young, and I just looked to those guys as like the people I wanted to be. People like Bill, specifically, that taught these classes and lived it. Like, they didn't do anything else. They went hunting, they went fishing, they taught their classes, and they inspired other people to do that. And through what they've done, they inspired me. And, I'm a really stubborn person and really goal oriented, and I've been that way since I was really young. And so I just decided this is what I'm going to do. And I made a lot of sacrifices to do that, as far as like living a normal life. And some of that stuff might be stuff that a lot of bow hunters can relate with. I did go to college through Prescott College in Arizona and studied experimental archaeology. That came later, and that wasn't a part of my career. And that was just an excuse to flint nap more and get a college degree, which is making stone tools. Building bows and arrows and flint napping and finishing the degree. That was my goal there. It wasn't like to go take a math class. It was just to do more of this stuff, and be able to continue to do it while my parents were pressuring me to get an education. So I just decided from a young age that this is what I wanted to do, and I committed to that. I started, putting myself out there and volunteering as an assistant. I got my first paid job teaching a fire by friction making class here in the Bay Area. It was through the Miwok Archaeological Preserve of Marin. And so at 16 years old, I taught my first, hand drill, bow drill class. I assisted with deer processing classes, hide tanning, sinew back bow building, flint napping. I was already very, very, very deeply immersed in that from a young age, and I just continued. And fortunately, through the dedication that I had to learning and bettering my own skills, I'm a bit of a competitive person, and although maybe it's not the mindset that everyone would identify with, when I was young, my goal was to be the best at this stuff. And I can't say that is my goal anymore, but for a long time, I wanted to be known as the person who was the best at this, at flint napping, at bow making. And it sounds silly to me now, like I can laugh a little bit about it, like, oh, that guy's the best at making arrowheads. Because there's a lot of people out there who are really dang good at like making arrowheads or making bows. Like, there's not a lot of people that are really good at all of it, right? So anyways, I put a lot of time and energy into bettering myself and volunteering, teaching little classes. As soon as I graduated, I got a paid position teaching survival classes, and I've been teaching ever since. So I've been teaching professionally since I was 18 years old. And just now I'm 33.
So walk us through, you said that there's a broad range of people that you're working with, but what does that look like, and what are they coming for?
Yeah. So a big part of what I do I teach a wide variety of different classes, and I work with a number of different organizations. And so most of what I teach is a 1-day course. It's a 1-day course. It gets tailored a little bit. And this is the course that I teach if I'm getting flown to different parts of the country, or if I'm teaching here locally in Santa Cruz. It's the same course that Highway Patrol, Air Rescue Crew contracted us for, and a number of different organizations, a lot of high profile folks. And I don't want to name drop or anything, but there's a lot of different people teaching survival, and it meant a lot to me to get chosen by professionals that need to learn this stuff to stay alive. Just to give some context there for why I really value some of those demographics and user groups being customers and students.
Okay.
So these classes, for the most part, are 1-day classes, and really what I focus on, I'd say 90% of my workload is teaching a 1-day class that focuses on teaching people how to procure their basic biological needs, how to prioritize those needs, and then get them in any situation. Although wilderness and lost person situations is what I specialize in, what I teach could be applied to a number of different settings, whether it's a building that collapsed, or being stuck on an island, or a plane going down, or any situation, right? Survival is what we're doing right now to stay alive, and wilderness survival is just repeating that in a natural setting, right? In a wilderness setting.
So a lot of just getting lost in the woods, let's say. You're going to be teaching the basic skills on how to make it through the night. Is that correct?
So I'll give you a little background on like kind of why I teach what I teach, and stop me at any point. But most survival situations in North America in this field, we say last between 12 to 72 hours, meaning if someone gets lost and they're reported missing, typically if search and rescue or doesn't find them within 3 hours, the window of time is that people are lost and then eventually rescued averages between 12 to 72 hours. And, that's a big window of time, but it's helpful for context. And the reason I bring that up is that allows us to prioritize what we need to do to stay alive in that period of time. When people do get lost, whether it's hunters, hikers, backpackers, the number one cause of death is exposure, which is like a blanket term for hypo or hyperthermia, basically overheating or freezing to death. And believe it or not, hunters they do make up a fairly large percentage of the folks that are getting rescued and recovered out of the backcountry every year. I wasn't aware of that until I, asked search and rescue and the California Highway Patrol helicopter crews who they're rescuing. And I was really surprised to hear how many of those people were hunters. And when I asked them why these people are being rescued, the number one reason was heat stroke. During our A-zone archery season, it gets really hot. And so there were folks hiking in with not enough water and getting dehydrated and then needing to get rescued. Anyways, to get back on topic, most survival situations last between 12 to 72 hours. And so that context allows us to kind of prioritize the things that we need to stay alive. And so as human beings, we have really basic biological survival needs. And those needs are air, shelter, water, fire, food, and tools as well. And I guess we could add other humans as well. So it would go air, shelter, water, fire, food, other humans, and tools. And those are things that we had before we were even a species, right? So we've been making fire, we've been hunting, we've been building tools. Like we've been doing that since before humans existed, like prior to us evolving from the hominids we evolved from. And so these are all really old biological needs that we've had for our entire existence. And so the reason I bring those needs up is when people get lost, it's easy to panic, right? And so creating a simple list, creating kind of like a basic list of what you need to do is a great way to stay calm and kind of create this illusion of control over the situation. And so, for example, if someone were to get lost, it's getting dark, they're turned around, maybe they're out elk hunting and their phone died, so they don't have their maps or whatever system to get back. At that point, rather than just freaking out and continuing to hike through the night, sitting down, taking a deep breath and recognizing, hey, I could stay out here tonight and I'm going to be fine. I'll build myself a really simple, quick shelter, which we can get into here at some point, and I'll crawl inside of that and be fine. And then when it gets light out, I can make my way out of here. And so the shelter, water, fire, food list is a way of simplifying our biological needs and creating a list that we can prioritize. And the reason it goes in that order is because it's something called the rule of threes. And the rule of threes is really widely taught in the survival world. And it goes like this. It goes, on average, human beings can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter and inclement conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, and then 3 years without human interaction. And so the rule of threes, I think the military came up with that a long time ago when they were developing their SEER program, which is their survival program. And it gives us a reason to focus on those basic priorities. And it gives us a reason to do shelter before fire or, so on and so forth. And those are just averages. There's examples of humans surviving, 20 plus days without water. But those averages basically allow us to simplify the situation, create this illusion of control, or, illusion might not be the right word, but kind of get some control over the situation in our own mind and not make poor decisions that are going to result in us getting more lost. Mm-hmm. When people do get lost, a very common, thing that happens is you hear these stories of hikers, at one point they were on the trail and then somehow they end up in like a deep canyon, right? Like we always hear about this, like, oh, these people finally were found and they were in this deep canyon way off trail. My question is like, dude, how did you go from being on a trail to now being in a deep canyon, right? And the only answer that I have for that is letting, panic creep in. And I'm sure like you've experienced that. I know I've experienced that. It's just adrenaline. Yeah. And when we let that happen, we're really hamstringing ourselves. And I think a great analogy for bow hunters is just like buck fever. Like everybody's experienced buck fever. Like, an animal comes in and you're just shaking like crazy. Yeah. And that experience of lack of control is kind of like a good way to envision what it would be like if you were to get lost and not be able to stay calm. Although instead of making a shot, that lack of control would be around, being able to do any fine motor skills and like make a fire or make complex decisions, right? And so what that's called is your sympathetic nervous system response. And it's also known as your fight or flight response. And the reason it matters is once you let that, kick on, you're limited to what we call gross motor movements and yes or no decisions. And so you're really hamstringing yourself, which brings us back to that shelter, water, fire, food. That's the reason I teach that, because, it helps us stay calm and it keeps the situation really simple when if we let our brains take it over, it might get really complicated and we might continue to make bad decisions that, are going to compound and result in us maybe not being rescued.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and I know fire can be very comforting, especially if it's cold.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And fire, fire making skills are really valuable. And I have to say, like overall, the people that I work with, when I do have hunters show up, I do have to give credit because a lot of the hunters that I meet are already pretty experienced when it comes to like hiking around in the dark or dealing with, bumping into mountain lions or bears or whatever it is, stuff that basic civilians and like the other people I deal with, they might freak out if they bumped into a bear or a mountain lion and do something really dumb.
Right.
And so as hunters, I think from the time spent outside, we do have a very good baseline for woodsmanship and survival skills. Although I think there's also a lot that can be built upon that. So that's really my intention.
I don't know about you, but I'm always purposely trying to bump into bears and mountain lions. That's my intention.
I know. Well, I've been making those mistakes bumping into mountain lions a little bit down here this year, as you know, and we can't hunt them down here. So at that point, it's just like a cool encounter. But yeah, the more animal encounters, the better.
Yeah, for sure. I know, when you're following herds of elk around or deer around, ungulates, the prey, the predators are just behind them or just to the side of them. So it is always cool to have those experiences for sure, even if they're not on the menu that time of year or at all. So that's very cool.
Yeah.
So
and I could, if you want, I mean, I could elaborate a little bit on shelter. We can talk about it later.
Yeah, no, that's why we're there. Let's get into what these 1-day classes and what folks are coming away with.
Right. Yeah. So I think like if I could give you guys one thing through this podcast for those people that are listening that would help them if they ever found themselves lost. There's a lot of information and a lot of this information can be challenging to go really deep into in just talking about it. Because survival is very dynamic and there's an infinite number of variables and no survival situation is ever going to be the same. And so every situation demands a unique type of approach to it. So there isn't any one way to really like address, like, this is what you do if you get lost. But that being said, if there was one way to do it, very generally, I do think that, staying calm and maintaining a positive mental attitude would probably be the biggest or most valuable tool in anyone's toolkit, because from a psychological perspective, there's nothing more valuable than a positive mental attitude and staying calm, cool, and collected. If you do let yourself panic and you do let that sympathetic nervous system response kick on, like I said before, you're really limiting what you're going to be capable of doing. And, I've worked with some Navy SEALs over the years, and they taught me a saying. It was, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your training. And that really illustrates that kind of that sympathetic nervous system response, or panicking or fight or flight response, because, those guys are dealing with such a high level of stress that they basically they train more than they see combat for the most part, but they train to be at their best, at their worst, if that makes sense. They want to be able to, if you're going into clear building, like there's no question. It's like they're just operating on that thing that they've done, thousands of times.
Making it second nature.
In the survival world, yeah, totally. Making it second nature. And in the survival world, there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of talk, and there's not always a lot of like actually doing it to back it up. There's a lot of people out there that don't put in the training time that they need to put in. And that's fine for them. But I do think that if they were to end up in a survival situation without, practicing making fire or practicing your wilderness first aid skills, I do think that expecting to be able to perform those without practicing them is unrealistic. And I think as traditional bow hunters, everybody listening to this can relate to that, because how many of us don't shoot all year, pick up our bow, and expect to just shoot lights out? Nobody.
No.
Right? So we practice diligently every day so that when the time comes, no matter the situation, we can do what needs to be done and make that perfect shot or do it to the best of our ability. And it's the same thing with survival. So practicing all this stuff is really valuable and really important, and thinking about it and everything that goes into it. It's not just a skill that you do once and then you can rely upon. It's really similar to traditional archery in that sense. So anyway, to get into kind of the skills that I teach in these classes, the classes are really based around that shelter, water, fire, food. And they're based around that because of the rule of threes, right? And because of, those are the things we need to stay alive. And that's why we're going to do them. So anyway, shelter always comes first. And the reason shelter comes first is because, exposure is the number one cause of death when people do get lost in outdoor recreation. I think in the national park system, the number one cause of death is falling due to selfies. So everybody watch out if you're on fences and taking pictures with your cell phone.
No, that's actually, we actually had a young man die here on the Oregon coast last year, I believe it was. Maybe it was the year before last, taking a selfie on the cliffs out at the beach and fell to his death. So that's, I actually, some of my kids knew the young man that did that. So that is a real thing. That is,
that sucks.
You really have to.
It is. Yeah, it's really taking unnecessary risk. It really illustrates kind of the modern dilemma that we've got ourselves into. But so as far as the exposure goes, right? So the first thing I get into is shelter. And, with shelter, I like to talk about, start off with, how does your body lose heat, right? Like, because when we're talking about a shelter, we're talking about heating. We haven't made a fire yet. And so our heat source is our own body heat. And so we're talking about calories and water creating metabolic heat, right? That's radiating off of our body. And with shelter, we're talking about trapping that. In the best kind of word for what that is, the mechanism of trapping body heat is insulation. And so the two main ways your body loses heat when it comes to sleeping outside in nature are conduction and convection. Conduction is through the ground. And I have a feeling everybody listening, and you and I both have experienced this before, there's a reason you carry a sleeping pad with your sleeping bag, right?
Right.
Like everybody's probably made the mistake of either not bringing a sleeping pad or having that thing pop on them and then freezing their butt off all night because the down or synthetic material in their bag is compressed and now their heat is getting sucked out through the ground. I make that mistake every couple of years. So conduction is taking place through a solid surface, and then and that's why, again, hunters tend to be more up on this stuff. Carrying a butt pad for glassing, that's not just for comfort, that's to insulate yourself from the ground, right? It serves a very practical purpose, because otherwise it's really easy to get cold glassing if your body heat is just being sucked into the ground or dissipating into the earth. And so conduction is heat transfer through a solid surface, so through the ground. And the solution there is insulating yourself. And the easiest kind of we'll get into insulation, but the easiest way to kind of define that as far as how to insulate yourself from the ground is just separate yourself from the ground with a pile of leaves or sagebrush, or just get yourself up off the ground, whether it's with a butt pad, a sleeping pad, your jacket, whatever it is, your backpack, just don't be sitting on the ground.
Cedar boughs.
Or laying on the ground.
Brush.
Cedar boughs, excellent. Yeah. Think about bears, right? We think about animals, when we talk about these survival shelters, I think animals are a great example, because when we notice occasionally, I know for you tracking a lot of bears and our friend Preston Taylor, oftentimes bears as well as wild hogs will create these elaborate nests and beds and occasionally line them with material. Obviously bears have a lot of a thick coat of fur on them, but pigs don't have as much hair, and so they have to have insulation beneath them, and they create these really elaborate nests. And the reason they do that is specifically to insulate themselves from the ground. So anyways, conduction is insulating yourself from the ground, and convective heat loss, which is the secondary heat loss mechanism, is what everybody knows is wind chill. And everybody's experienced wind chill. And how that applies to shelter is less so wind chill in the sense that, yes, you do want to be out of the wind and you do want to have your layers on, but it's more so trapping air around your body. And so what that looks like is basically making a giant pile of leaves and crawling inside of it. And that's what we call a Sasquatch sleeping bag, which is, that's what you know about Bigfoot. Bigfoot is, we've yet to tag out on them, but they're around, right? So that when Bigfoot builds these big nests, that's apparently, and so we call it a Sasquatch sleeping bag. Another term for it is like a dust bed or a leaf nest. But essentially, it's just, you do your best to make a pile of leaves and you sandwich yourself in there. Typically what that looks like is digging like a little trench out in the center so that you got some leaves beneath you, and then just hopping in there and pulling them over the top of you. And the way that works is the leaves or cedar boughs or spruce boughs or sword ferns or whatever it is, the grass, sagebrush, whatever it is, it has, dead air space inside of it. Dead air space they're small air pockets, right? The same way that our down insulation and synthetic insulation works. It's just on a less efficient level. And so that big pile of material is what we call insulation. And the way that I define insulation is any material that has a low weight to volume ratio, right? And the lower that weight to volume ratio is, the more efficient that material is going to be at insulating. So if we think about your sleeping bag, right? Like you have a real good down sleeping bag that you picked up last season. Yep. I remember we were talking about it, and it's probably one of the best bags you could own. And it's got some really high quality down in it. And in that sleeping bag, I don't remember exactly like what temperature yours is rated to.
It's a 20.
But 20. Okay. So, those sleeping bags are packed with goose down. And what the goose down does is it just creates fluff. And fluff has dead air space inside of it. And dead air space is a technical term, and it can be kind of hard to envision. But another way to look at it is any material that's really fluffy, or when we think about a puffy jacket, right? Anything that you throw on or throw over you that is going to keep you really warm. And in nature, that's going to be, basically whatever you can find. But the best would be dead vegetation, ideally pine needles, deciduous leaves, dead ferns, stuff like that. And the idea is that if you did get lost, you're just going to do your best to make the biggest pile you can. And I don't want to even mention a specific, number or volume of material, because resourcefulness is like a mindset and survival that I think is really important. And resourcefulness is doing the best you can with what you have. And so mentioning you need 6.5 feet or some arbitrary number, that's cool. But ultimately, you're going to do whatever you can do. And you're just going to have to be okay with that. And so if you can get a foot of debris on the ground and curl up into the fetal position on top of that thing, and wake up every hour and do jumping jacks and burpees, and then crawl back down and curl up into a ball, you're going to make it. If you can get 8 feet of debris and curl inside, you're going to be warm, and you're probably going to fall asleep and wake up the next morning and feel like you had a great night's sleep. So exactly how much you get isn't necessary, is kind of besides the point, because it's more about the action of insulating yourself from the ground and from the air around you. I don't know if that was too technical, but
no,
do you have any questions about any of that stuff I mentioned?
No, that was some great stuff, and I could honestly say that I didn't know half of that stuff. So I'm learning as we go here. I think this is great.
Cool. And so I think resourcefulness, this idea of resourcefulness, is something that we could bring up again here real quickly, because everything that I'm going to talk about today, I think it's important for everyone to know that, again, survival situations are constantly changing. You're never going to see the same situation twice. And we're talking about, what could be a potentially life-threatening situation. And particularly if you panic and begin to make, poor decisions.
So what about in a wet climate? That debris shelter, is that going to work when it's pouring rain outside or snowing outside? Like what?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So my answer, if you were like at one of my classes and I had just, talked about shelter, would be like, well, what are your options? Like you're probably not going to get a fire going because it's wet. And yes, the answer is it will work. And the answer is going to be like, you probably are going to be wet and cold and uncomfortable, but you will be warm enough to stay alive. Wet material that actually can insulate very, very well, because when vegetation gets wet, it doesn't lose its insulation value like, say, down or synthetic material can, right? Okay. Because you need you need a really large volume of it, and leaves will compress a bit when they're wet, but they're not going to get so compressed that they turn into like an entirely different mud. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so ultimately my answer would be like that concept of resourcefulness, and like you're going to do the best you can because your only other option is dying of hypothermia or being or potentially, which is the challenging part of teaching survival. Is sometimes the what ifs are tricky to address because the resourcefulness question is just this like reoccurring trend of like, that's where you're at. You're going to apply what I just talked about to the best of your ability. And the cool thing about that Sasquatch sleeping bag or that duck bed is that I guarantee everybody, even if they're injured, like if you're conscious and I was like, hey, you're going to die or you're going to make a pile of leaves, like everybody can do that, right? It's like, it's fully attainable. Whereas if it's like, hey, you're going to die or you're going to rub all these sticks together to get fire, like that's way less attainable, right? Because it requires a certain amount of skill level prior to that experience or that situation. And so everybody has collected a pile of leaves before, and everybody is capable of doing that, even if you have a broken leg. And some tricks I could mention or tips that, in case we move away from this here eventually is, one, ideally when you make your deathbed, you're stretched out. So the goal is when you crawl into that pile of leaves, the goal is to be comfortable. Like we don't necessarily want to sacrifice comfort if we don't have to. And so I think everybody would prefer to sleep stretched out rather than like stuffed up into a ball. But if you were like, say you were up hunting desert mule deer up in the high country or sheep hunting or something, and you're in an environment where there's like, it's mostly rocks, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And most of these places, these animals live, like there's got to be sagebrush or grass or something, like they're eating something. Like no animal can live off of rocks, right? So there's something there within, your, line of sight. Usually if you're going into a location where there's not, then you better be prepared, because there's no way you can fall back on this stuff if you're like, somehow in an environment where there's nothing, which there's not very many of those, but like
escape. I always keep a 55-gallon contractor's like thick plastic bag folded up in my day pack, even if I'm going bare minimum. I always have that with me because I feel like that could act as a meat bag, so I don't get blood in my bag when I'm packing, if I, kill something, or it can help me, gather up a bunch of debris, or I have a place to put whatever I run into, or I've even spent the night in the woods and made that a way to keep myself dry. And not because I was lost, just because the elk were bugling and I didn't want to leave them. So I think that's like a really good thing to have with you. Maybe a space blanket. I usually have a little space blanket, and then that contractor bag. And man, I can tell you in a pinch that has made my night out in the bush more comfortable when I didn't intend to, backpack somewhere or camp somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. I think that those contractor bags can be, used. They're very versatile. You could use it as a pack cover. You could use it as a poncho. You could cut that thing and you could use it as a tarp over a pile of insulation.
Right.
Like You could use it as a vapor barrier in between you and the ground, or if you're in a snowy environment, digging a snow cave. Like, plastic is endlessly useful.
Yeah.
And in the survival world, you know, there's a lot of these kits, like people get hung up on kits. And I think what I tell people is like, hey, if that's great if you want to buy like a really elaborate survival kit, but just do me a favor. If you're going to do that, learn it.
Right.
Learn how to use that thing. The best analogy would be like a first aid kit. You know what I mean? Like, when you see those big, you know, the ones that I carry, they're pretty elaborate. And like, it's like, why is someone carrying a SAM splint if they don't even know how to use it? Or, you know, it's like bear spray. Like, why are you carrying bear spray if it's in the bottom of your backpack?
Right.
Like, it's not going to be very helpful at that
point. For sure.
So carrying stuff that you are very comfortable with, familiar with, and doesn't feel so special that it's like you're afraid to use it. I think it's important to carry that kind of stuff. Because the reason I say it's not so special or that you're afraid to use it is a lot of these survival kits, you know, it's like a one-time use tool of some kind, or you got to break it apart to make it work. And, you know, all of those serve very specific purposes, and they're excellent tools. But I do think that, you know, you have to practice with them. It's just like shooting your broadheads, you know. It's
right.
Like, you're gonna, if you can't sharpen a broadhead, then you're kind of in trouble. You got to carry a whole bunch of extra ones with you to pop on your arrows, and you know what I mean. It's like you got to get good at shooting them before you even go hunting with them. There's a lot of that crossover.
It goes back to
your gear.
It goes back to developing the skill set, you know, AKA woodsmanship skills, not just relying.
The more you know, the less you need.
Right, and the more you take into the woods, the less you take into the woods, the more you come out with. I like that one a lot too. But yeah, I think that contractor bag is a great one. I mean, you can even use it as we're talking. I was thinking about how you could use that to gather all of your insulation before while you're building your bed, and then using it as a vapor barrier below you or above you or whatnot. So yeah, I think that's a cheap one, an easy one to use. I think everyone, if you're not already carrying one of those, and it's kind of a no-brainer to have that in your bag.
Especially for meat packing. Like, even if you're not going to use it for survival, like I carry a couple garbage bags, or at least a contractor bag in my, kill kit or whatever, so that when I do go to process that animal, it's easy if when things get all bloody, if it's if it's fat, if the fat gets all over everything, if it's a bear or a hog, like we have all experienced that, and it just keeps and it keeps a better end product. And keep it cleaner. Yeah,
you can lay your meat out on the bag while even if you have meat bags there, I'll get that bag out so I can lay the back straps and stuff while I'm butchering, and then put them into the meat bags and hang them in trees or whatever. But yeah, it's just a great barrier to have, and it's inexpensive, and you can put them into a fanny pack or a small day bag or whatever. So if you don't already have that,
it could be in your back pocket.
Yeah, it's a great one to have. Cool.
That's a good one to carry. And so the last thing I want to mention, what I was going to say before we move on from shelter, or if you have other questions about it, is I just wanted to just kind of throw a scenario out there. If you are in the high country and you are in a really rough environment, what taking action for shelter would look like would be basically getting out of the wind, right? Which is what a lot of us do when we're glassing. You want to try and find a glassing spot where you're not just, if the wind is ripping, like that's step one. Find a spot you can glass from where you're not just going to be annihilated by the wind unless you got a bunch of layers on. So get out of the wind, and then do your best to insulate yourself from the ground. Like whatever you can do. If it's sagebrush, that's great. If it's grass, that's great. If you have to move down to tree line, then you have to move down to tree line. But you got to get up off the ground. And the last thing I wanted to say is, yes, we want to be comfortable and we want to sleep stretched out, and that's something you can 100% do if you have, obviously your sleeping bag, or if you can collect enough material to make a big duff bed or a Sasquatch sleeping bag. But if you can't, curling up into the fetal position will actually retain 70% of your long wave radiation heat loss, which is basically your body heat, right? And so Curling up into a ball, though uncomfortable, is extremely efficient. And in a true emergency, it could be getting out of the wind, ripping up a pile of brush, laying down on top of it, putting all your clothes on, throwing that contractor bag over you, or crawling in, inside of it, potentially if it's raining, and curling up into a ball. Now, any plastic or vapor barrier could cause condensation issues, but we're talking about staying alive. And I think most of us hunters are all on the same page when it comes to clothing and the right clothing. And as traditional archers, we've been steeped in wearing wool, wearing the right clothes, and, clothing is important, and wearing the right clothes is important. And I think the old blue jeans and flannel thing is awesome, especially if it's a wool flannel, but those blue jeans, when they get wet, man, they're not going to be doing a whole lot for you. At that point, you might as well just take them off.
Yeah.
Because they're made out of cotton.
Cotton kills.
I think cotton kills. Yeah. And I think everybody knows that. And so it's not something we have to talk too deeply about. That information's out there, but wearing the right clothes it is really important. They don't have to be expensive. You could pull a Colton Gimlin and just go to, or Gilman and go to the Goodwill or whatever, like he does. He's sponsored by Goodwill, I think he told me. So anyways, you can go to
Carson, a lot of
tell
guys.
them Colton sent you.
Yeah.
Tell them Colton sent you, and you're going to get like 20% off, and pick out all the flannels and wool clothes you want. And, the old school way used to be military surplus stores, but yeah, wear the right clothes. That's all I want to say. We don't have to spend too much time on that because everyone knows.
What about obtaining water? I know, my situation is I live somewhere where there's water isn't abundant, and I have been guilty. I run out of water, and I don't have a way to filter water. I'm almost like going without water, until Preston has kind of showed me where you can find where you can take your chances with wild water, and how to obtain that. Yeah. It's like, I'm
Let's talk about that.
Too scared to drink this water.
Yeah.
And then I'm going thirsty, and now I'm getting a headache, and you can't, you can't hold us to this stuff, but you got to kind of use your head when it comes to this. But yeah, let's get into water.
Yeah, let's do it. So the context that we're talking in here is we're talking to hunters, right?
Right.
And so we're all out there looking for animals. And so typically, as far as hunting goes, if there's water, then if there's animals, there's water for the most part, right? Because as everybody knows, how many of those giant bucks in Arizona are killed over water? I don't know, all of them, most of them. Yeah. That's why the trail camera ban happened, part of it, which I'm really excited about. And so anyways, if there's wildlife, there's water. And so compared to hikers and stuff, I think us hunters are a little bit less likely to find ourselves in landscapes that are completely void of water. But that being said, let's just assume, right?
Well, yeah.
As far as water goes,
I've hunted elk in the high country where water is hard to come by. It's hidden. Let's say, it's the water sources are not abundant. And so and I think that guys that hunt some high country elk and mule deer, there's water around, but it's not in every draw. It's not coming out of every seep. So there's a difference.
Yeah, I can relate because where I live, hunting deer, and currently in the last 10 years in California, we've had just a super severe drought. And so water's just been harder and harder to come by. Finding water is going to be, as far as locating a water source, there's a little bit there's some general rules of thumb that I'm going to go over, but there will be kind of unique tricks for every environment. And I think something we'll probably talk about later, and that I've noticed been a trend on your guys' show, which I really enjoy, is just learning about the place that you're in, right? Developing a connection to it. And locating water is part of locating water is learning about your landscape, right, in the long term. But that being said, a lot of us travel to hunt, and so there are some general rules of thumb. The first thing I like to talk about with water is just, whether or not it's safe to drink. and why we even disinfect it in the first place. There are a number of different waterborne pathogens, and the main reason, I would say the most dangerous one is Giardia, which is probably the primary reason we end up disinfecting our water in the backcountry. Although, leptospirosis and cryptosporidium are also common and can also make you uncomfortable. Giardia is the one that's known to cause amoebic dysentery. Although I'm not a doctor, the CDC does say that Giardia has an incubation period of 5 days to 3 weeks plus. There's a lot of variables when you're drinking infected water, right? Because Giardia is either I think it's a protozoa or it might be an amoeba, but it's a very small organism that we can't see with our eyeballs, right? So when you're drinking water out of a water source that you're not sure is clean, or that you're not sure if it's clean or not, whether you get sick, part of that has to do with how infected the water source is, right? And so that sip of water could have 2 protozoa or amoebas in it, or it could have 10 million. And so that's why some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, the rules of thumbs, a lot of it takes that into consideration, that we're doing our best to reduce our exposure to waterborne pathogens. Because let's face it, sometimes we can't disinfect our water. It's just not a possibility in that moment in time. And in order to disinfect your water, you either need chemical disinfection, some type of purification device, whether that's a filter, a SteriPen, lice straw, chlorine dioxide or iodine tablets. You need something, whether it's a chemical or a tool or a fire to boil it. But anyways, you need something to disinfect your water, right? And if you don't have that, then you're not disinfecting your water. So there are primitive ways to do it, but to be honest with you, they require a lot of, certain skills to get to that place. And I believe that if you are lost and you are chronically dehydrated, you're better off just drinking that water, whether it's infected or not, because the likelihood of you dying of dehydration is far greater than you dying from amoebic dysentery prior to being rescued. If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I don't think anyone should be negligent, but I do think that in a dry environment, if you come across a puddle or, some stagnant water that looks really foul and you're super dehydrated and you're lost and people are looking for you, like, I'm going to drink that water. I'm going to do my best to reduce my odds of getting sick using some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about here. But at the end of the day, I'm just trying to stay alive. And if I get rescued and I get sick, fine, I'll go get antibiotics and I'll be okay. You know what I mean? So anyways, I just wanted to preface it with that if you were in that bad spot, you're just going to drink.
Right.
And so as far as kind of the rules of thumb, as far as locating water goes, I look for, what I teach people is to look for ecological indicators. And ecological indicators are basically topography, vegetation, and plants and wildlife, flora and fauna.
Right.
So we could say topography and flora and fauna. Mm-hmm. So as far as topography goes, water's found on the lowest point of the landscape. So unless you're looking for snowmelt, we're traveling downhill. We're looking in the canyons, that's where all the elk wallows and hog wallows are found.
In the draw.
And sometimes in the draw, exactly. So you got to look down. And you got to go down to look for them. Now, before you travel down into that deep canyon, if you can look, and you say you're in the desert or you're in open country, you can look for bright green, dense growing vegetation.
Get your binos
out.
Where
you live, that might not as a... where you live, get your binos out. Everybody's got binos, right? Look down in there and see if you can, 1, see water or animal trails going into that draw. And 2, if you're in like an otherwise arid environment, look for something that stands out, like contrasting color. So bright, dense, green growing vegetation. Specifically, I look for certain plants and trees like willow, aspen,
rushes,
cottonwood, rushes, red alder. Those are some
sedges,
big ones, cattail, tule, sedges. Yeah, again, the more you know about nature, you can learn, there's all these organisms have specific needs, right? And you can be like, oh, the sedges need water to survive. I see sedges with my glass down in the bottom of that canyon. There's water down there.
Yep.
Now, just because there's water for the sedges to drink doesn't mean it's surface water. So you might have to dig a little bit for it. But anyways, we'll get into that. So you're going to look down in the draws. You're going to look for vegetation, bright, dense green growing vegetation. If there's a lot of animal trails leading down into there, there's a good chance there's water. You want to go down there, check it out. As far as like mitigating risk of getting sick goes, the rule of thumb is you want to do your best to avoid slow moving, warm, stagnant water. Technically, the larger the body of water, the more likely it's going to carry some type of waterborne pathogen. And so you typically want to avoid like large rivers or large creeks, ponds, lakes, things of that nature, because from a point of view of statistically speaking, watersheds start as small springs, right? And they come together and they create bigger springs, and then those come together and create creeks, and those come together to create rivers and lakes. And so the bigger the body of water you're drinking from, you're technically drinking from, potentially thousands or more smaller bodies of water. And only one of those needs to be infected for you to be getting sick drinking out of that creek. Are you tracking?
Yep.
Okay. So by drinking out of a small body of water, you're already reducing your odds. So if you do find a big river, maybe walk upstream a little bit, look for a tributary that's flowing into it. You don't have to go very far upstream, 20 yards is plenty. But the smaller body of water you can drink out of, the better.
Yep.
What I tell people is you want to look for small, fast-flowing, ice-cold, crystal-clear water sources. So if you can find a small, fast-flowing, ice-cold, crystal-clear water source, you're going to be significantly reducing your risk. Now, that's just surface water. And surface water only makes up a small percentage of water sources in an environment. So say, you're hiking along and you end up in a draw and it's really wet and there's a bunch of ferns and sedges and you step on the ground and you can hear that squish, like there's water beneath your feet. And a lot of times in those places, there's either some bedrock that traps the water under there, or there's actually an aquifer if it's on a hillside that is kind of like leaking into the hillside. And in that situation, you could just get down on your hands and knees, dig a little hole, and let it sit. Usually it'll fill up with water, let the dirt settle, stick your face down in there, and just drink from it. And that's a very safe water source. I'm not going to say it's 100% safe to drink, but it's a very low probability of you getting sick drinking from groundwater sources. Now, if you were, say you rolled your ankle or something like that, and you got down on this big river, and for some reason you get down on some big water source, whether that's a lake or a river, and you don't want to drink out of that water source itself. You can still, I would recommend is drinking out of it if you're severely dehydrated and just taking that risk. But if you can, what you could do is dig what we call a seep hole. They were traditionally called artesian wells, and basically it's similar to what I just talked about, that where you just dig a little hole in the ground. But the idea is you're going to find an area like what we would, imagine you're with like your family or your friends, like a spot that you would think of as like a beach, kind of an area that has a very gradual slope coming out from the water source. It could be mud. It doesn't matter what kind of soil type it is necessarily, but the reason you have to find a gradual slope, and it can't be a really steep bank, is because what you're going to do is dig a hole that goes through the ground and actually goes beneath the water level. And so if it's a really steep bank, you might have to dig like a 4-foot deep hole, which is a complete waste of time and energy at that point. So anyways, you're going to find a beach. You want to find a nice level spot. If you can find a spot that's really gradual, then you can go like 10 or 12 feet away from that water source, dig a little hole in the ground, pick up a stick. You never want to dig with your hands because you could accidentally cut yourself. So, grab a stick, dig a hole in the ground, and eventually, once you start getting to elbow depth, water should start leaking into that hole. A lot of that depends on the angle of the bank, right? The steeper the bank, the deeper the hole, the closer you'll have to be to the water source. But the concept behind it is that the ground is going to be acting like a filter. Now, it's not going to be nearly as efficient as a filter, but the idea is that you're just mitigating risk by reducing your odds of getting sick by using the ground to actually filter out potentially some of that protozoa or that bacteria or those amoebas that would be in the water source itself.
Yeah, that's
called a seed pool.
Seed pool. Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Great advice. And like you said, also, if you have the ability to look for where that water's coming from, usually like here in the Oregon coast, you got water. It's abundant, but like you say, you go to the draw that's feeding that river, and you're going to have a creek, and you go up that creek, and you're going to find secondary draws that are going to be what we call tributaries that are feeding that. And the smaller that water source, often here you can find where it's just coming out of the ground. And man, when I find that, I'm filling up my water bottle. I don't care about the filter. I want to drink that wild water. It's delicious, and it's full of minerals. And and I used to not have that education and just push myself to get back to the truck to drink water. Now it's kind of fun to find good, safe, wild water to drink.
Oh yeah, for sure. If I can drink out of a spring, I'm drinking out of a spring. The less treatment I have to do, the better. I drink a lot of wild water, and just because of my career, sometimes I'll just experiment with different water sources when I'm not in the backcountry, just to kind of see what my reaction is. And if I'm obviously not going to go drinking out of somebody's septic tank or like a big river with a bunch of houses around it, but I have been pleasantly surprised over my lifetime at the fact that I've drank out of water that I deemed questionable and didn't get sick. That being said, I think it is important to exercise caution when it comes to drinking water. But if you can find those little springs and seeps and wild water, I think you're going to be fine. And I do the same thing as you. And
in a dry, arid climate, or in a big burn, or high desert, or even low desert, it's pretty apparent where those oases are. I mean, there'll be a green patch somewhere, and where that water is present, and you can go there and capitalize on it.
Yeah, and it's funny talking about that and hearing you say that, because I usually have to spend a lot of time describing that to normal people, because I think hunters, and you particularly, know your landscape very well, and that's part of learning the place that you're in, and that's an excellent example of how knowing more about the place you're in could potentially save your life, or keep you from getting sick from drinking funky water. And
locating game. A
lot of people don't
right?
even know what a tributary is. Yeah, and locating game, just scouting, learning where your water sources is usually a component of scouting.
Yeah.
And so, it's cool talking about it in the context of hunting.
Yeah, because those water sources, those flora and fauna are going to be generally, nutrient dense food sources for game. So not only just the water, but they're going to be feeding in those areas as well. Yeah,
for sure. And I think, it's cool talking about it in that context. I don't end up teaching hunters as much. And so just like you saying what you just said is great to hear, because a lot of times, I have to spend a bunch of time describing that.
Sure.
And I think everybody that's listening probably has a picture in their mind's eye of a burn and what a seep looks like in a burn, or what water looks like down in a canyon when there's thick vegetation. And so it's cool. And it makes it a little bit easier for me to speak and describe what you would do and how to locate water and mitigate risk around drinking water when you can't disinfect it.
Let's touch on fire real quick. I know that I don't have. I mean, I don't have skill set to make fire if I don't have a lighter or flint or something, and I'm usually pretty smart to keep something on me so that I can make fire. Is it really, without the practice, I mean, is a guy going to find a way to create fire without one of those tools?
No,
I didn't think so.
I don't think that friction. I think friction fire is a really valuable skill, but the reason that I teach friction fire is so that I mean, I get almost 100% success rate on my students with the bow drill within 2 hours of it being introduced to them. And so they're making embers, but whether they could repeat that in an emergency situation is, I would say it's unlikely they could repeat that without a lot of practice. So as far as fire making goes, I do think that you need to be carrying some type of emergency fire starting kit with you if you truly want to have something to light a fire to save your life. I'm not a big fan of building a fire to sleep next to, but I do know that there are environments that I've been in where if it's so cold and it's so windy and there's snow on the ground that like the best option is getting in like a tree well or under a tree and getting a fire going to warm up. I think a lot of I think with survival, when we're talking about fire, I do think that sometimes people overlook the amount of stress and discomfort they may be in when they're actually needing to light that fire. And so when you are talking about building your fire starting kit or having your emergency preparedness kit, I think it's important to envision having to use those tools in a really bad situation, whether maybe you broke your dominant hand or whether you have, your hands are so numb from being cold or soaking wet, whatever it might be. I do think it's important to consider that when you're picking, the tools that you are going to use to light a fire. And then I also think it's important to practice with those tools. And so what I tell people to do is I don't think there's anything. I mean, I think it's cool to be able to rub sticks together to make fire. I can do it a bunch of different ways, and I can go walk around right now. I could walk outside and snap some sticks off a tree and rub them together and get fire. But, I still carry a lighter. I'm a big believer in carrying a lighter. I can tell you what I think.
The lighter is my go-to, and I've heard a lot of people say that that can fail. What's your go-to if you're going to have one source to make fire that's going to be reliable and compact and not take up a lot of weight or room in your kit?
Yeah. So as far as fire starting, I do think that there's a little bit there of that personal preference. But what I would recommend for most people would be like a Bic lighter or something like that. Mm-hmm. They do make, stormproof lighters and windproof lighters, and those are awesome too. I haven't purchased a whole bunch of them, and I've always just used either a Bic, or I used to be a big believer in those like clear lighters where you can adjust the flame. I really liked those because you could see the fuel in the lighter, so you could know what you're working with. And then I also like the idea of being able to just have a giant flame, right? Like the bigger that flame is, the better off you're going to be at lighting a fire. So either a Bic lighter or one of those clear ones with the adjustable flames. But I think in conjunction with a lighter, I think it's important to carry accelerant. Because if we're truly talking about this as like a life and death situation of you being able to get that fire going, having an accelerant is really valuable. And there's a lot of different types of accelerants. And what an accelerant is it's just a really volatile material that will light on fire extremely easily. And once it's lit, it's going to be extremely hard to put out. Typically, they only burn from like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if it's a real good one. I use basically, it's a modern made accelerant that's like it's called a fire plug. And it's basically a paraffin wax impregnated cotton with a lot of volatile oils in there that are really flammable. So what I do is I take one of those and shred them apart. The old school, version of that would be a cotton ball soaked in Vaseline, mm-hmm. Which those also work. They're not nearly as well. They don't work nearly as well as kind of these newer fire starting accelerants. Okay. But there's a lot of commercially made ones. Some of them are similar to like an alcohol swab that you would have in your first aid kit.
Dryer lint. I've heard of people using. I know.
Dryer lint works.
I know where I live. Locating fat wood or pitchy, cedar or whatever. That stuff can just pine. you can harvest some of that stuff and really get things going fast.
Yeah, if you can locate pine sap or spruce sap or any conifer sap, that's a great natural accelerant, especially in conjunction with any type of like tinder or like fluffed up cedar bark or some grasses, maybe some dryer lint, anything like that. Mm-hmm. The only downside is that you'd have to find those things,
right?
Which, I mean, that's part of developing your woodsmanship, is learning and being able to use those things. But when I teach this stuff, I talk about it kind of like, I was never a big video game person, but like you're unlocking levels. So by putting in time and learning about a place, you unlock different levels of basically resources. And so the more you learn, the more that's going to be available to you, right? Because not so long ago, like everything we needed for survival, we were getting from nature.
Right.
We've definitely lived as a species in nature longer than we've lived outside of it. And we're still physiologically designed to live in nature. And so I think that's why a lot of us as bow hunters and traditional bow hunters, I think there's something deep inside of us that kind of drives us to do that. But anyway, as far as fire goes, I do believe in the modern accelerants from an emergency standpoint, just because it's in your back pocket, right? Like, you don't have to find it. You don't need a light. You can just whip that thing out, grab a bunch of sticks and get that thing lit. Now, in your environment, especially, fire starting is extremely challenging.
Yes.
And so in your environment, there's a couple of like rules that you probably follow. One of them is you never collect your firewood off the ground, at least initially, right? So you're kindling to get your fire lit. You want to avoid collecting anything that's laying on the ground, because especially if it's wet out, even if it's dry out, anything touching the ground is going to have a lot more moisture in it than anything that's like standing dead or branches that are attached to trees. So usually, you're looking for a hemlock tree and you're going under there, or Doug fir, and you're breaking off a bunch of those really small pencil lead thickness branches. And so you don't want to collect off the ground. That's a really important one. You want to be really meticulous about collecting everything you need before you go ahead and light your fire. That way it's all there, and then you can get it lit and you can get that fire burning, so it's not going to go out. And then you can kind of walk around looking for bigger sticks to start drying out and keep your fire going. But I think the mistake I see people make is they rush it. And I think when you're making a fire, it's important to just take a deep breath and take your time, because if you do it right, you only have to do it once. And I can't tell you how many times I've done like a 1-match fire drill, which is like where you give someone 1 match, and you say, hey, okay, you got 5 minutes, get a fire going. And even really high level, Boy Scouts or people who possess or, have a lot of experience, I've seen them fail.
Yeah.
And so it can happen to any of us.
It can. And I want to share a little story with everybody listening, because this is serious stuff. And what I urge you to do is to make sure that your fanny pack, your day pack, whatever it is that you take on your hunts, we're talking to hunters here. Don't make this pack so elaborate or don't make it an inconvenience to the point where you don't want to take it with you. And I'm going to share a quick story. There's a man that just lived down the road from where I live now. His name is Sean Higgins, 41 years old. And him and his son, Trevor Higgins, were hunting blacktail deer in late October. And this is they were up in the southern Oregon, kind of a wilderness area, Shasta Costa drainage, down there near the Rogue River. And Sean was known to be, he's a friend of a friend. A lot of my friends were good friends with Sean. I'd met Sean a handful of times, and he was known, they called him Dr. Blacktail. One heck of a hunter, an outdoorsman. And they would hunt by themselves and get back together for lunch or dinner. And on this particular hunt, I believe there was 4 of them hunting. They decided to not take their bags, not to take their GPS units, not to take, they had packs that had everything they needed in them. but for whatever reason, they forgo taking those with them, and Sean came up missing, and Trevor went looking for him, and Trevor came up missing, and through search and rescue parties and helicopter, I mean, this weather came in, and it didn't stop for months. This weather, and we were search and rescue was able to rescue his son. Trevor, 4 days later, severe hypothermia, and he was close to passing. And his father was never found to this day. They never found him. Not the next summer, not the next year, not search dogs. He's never been found. His wife recently, I think it's 2016. So it's been 5 years, and she's just recently been able to obtain a death certificate for Sean. And this is a very experienced hunter, and you think, that would never happen to me. Let me tell you, I went out there with hundreds of people looking for him. These were hunters, and we had all our gear on, and people had their dogs, and we brought in trained dogs, and he was never found. So it's serious business, and this can happen to you. And don't leave your gear behind, because they had everything they needed to survive, and they didn't have it with them, and it cost Sean his life. Yeah,
and that's a real sad story, and unfortunately, that same story has happened, hundreds or thousands of times to hunters all over the place, and there's always like common trends, and that initial mistake is leaving your gear at the car.
Yep.
And it's especially hard for us hunters, because I think, in the survival world, as far as avoiding ending up in a survival situation, a big part of that is telling somebody where you're going and when you're going to be back. And in the hunting community, that's just, you don't usually do that, because that's sharing your spot, which isn't a problem necessarily, but a lot of us don't make a habit out of like sending GPS locations to our buddies before we go out there. And some of us, carry, emergency beacons, like a Garmin InReach or something like that, just in case something were to happen. And that's a really smart thing to do, because if you were to fall out of a tree stand, if something were to happen, you get gored by an animal, like let's face it, that might be the only tool you have that's actually going to get you out of there. Because there are certain situations where the skills are great, but you need medical attention.
Absolutely.
And so a big part of not forgetting your pack is, like you said, don't make it so big and elaborate that you're not carrying it. And that's a mistake that all of us have made, where we're like, man, this thing's heavy. It's cumbersome. It's annoying. And I know you and I are constantly talking about different pack options, because we're always thinking like, oh, it would be really convenient to have this little small bag or this. We're always trying to downsize so that it's something convenient to have with us, something that we'll just always have on our back.
Yeah.
And so
the less you take into the woods, the more you come out with, but you do need to have the right things with you, and take the basics with you that can get you. I always want to go deep and further, I feel like into the evening when I'm chasing elk. And just having that little bag on me, knowing I got a water filter, I've got a lighter, I've got a plastic bag, I've got a space blanket, I've got